Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about suprasegmentals and diacritics. This is from chapter 6 in your book. So before now, we've really focused on transcribing single words, transcribing each sound, each phoneme that we hear in that word. But that's not how we talk. We don't talk in single words, we talk in sentences and in conversation. And so we need a way to, when we're transcribing, to show that we're not making every single sound. When I say butter, I'm not using every single sound, B-U-T-T-E-R. I'm not saying butter. I changed that word slightly in order to be able to talk quicker and continue with my conversation, whatever I'm saying. So in order to characterize those differences that we're hearing when we transcribe, we need to use suprasegmentals and diacritics. So let's get started. What have we learned so far? So we've discussed speech in terms of segmental components, which refer to the phoneme level, what I was just saying. We've transcribed single phonemes in isolation by themselves and in single words. We do want to remember, though, that articulators do not move from sound to sound in a series of separate steps. We have speech that consists of lots of overlapping motor movements, and in connected speech especially, our articulators are overlapping, so each phoneme's production overlaps. And it's also influenced by the other phonemes that surround it. And that leads us to our first topic, which is co-articulation. Co-articulation is the influence of one speech sound upon its neighboring speech sound. It describes the concept that articulators are continually moving into position for other segments over the stretch of speech. So it's not substituting sounds, it's kind of altering those sounds. So you're still using the same phoneme, but that phoneme is altered because of the sounds that surround it. For example, we have, when we're using C, this first example here, your lips are going to be spread for this sound due to a spread unrounded vowel E. So watch, C. But when I use S in the word Sue, my lips are more rounded because they're anticipating that rounded vowel oo. Okay, so Sue, C. They're both S, but that S is going to be changed based on what vowel is coming after it. It's the same thing with key versus coo. So the key, we're going to have a much different K than when we use coo with the oo following it, so it's much more rounded. We also have a term called assimilation. Assimilation is going to be some articulatory changes by which one speech sound becomes similar or sometimes even identical to a neighboring speech segment. So you're conforming one sound to the manner or the place of articulation of its neighboring sounds. So for instance, you're going to, if we're changing based on the place, it might be that instead of the phrase that person, it might be that person. So the T in that is actually changing to a P to anticipate the P in the word person. Another example might be is if we changed, let's see, in that case might turn into that case. So the T in that becomes a K to anticipate that K phoneme in the word case. We can also assimilate based on manner. So that typically happens when we're talking really rapidly. For example, if I said that said, I might say that said. So the S changes in order to more quickly say that phrase. If I said good night, I usually, if I'm saying it more quickly, I might say good night. So gun versus good. Or in the might turn into in a. So in the box, in a box. See how that, it just helps us say those phrases faster. So we're using assimilation there. They're crossing phonemic boundaries which result in major phonetic change. So the difference between assimilation and co-articulation is co-articulation is going to be a variation of the phoneme, whereas assimilation, you're actually changing the phoneme. Okay? There are two types of assimilation, progressive and regressive. Under progressive, we're looking at changes in the phonetic characteristic due to the influence of a sound occurring earlier in the word. So the sound segment influences a following sound. For instance, telephone might be changed to telephone. So the L becomes a D because of the T place of articulation. Ice cream might turn to ice stream, so the K becomes a T. Some more examples. Bath soap, the S becomes dentalized. So this is not necessarily a change in the phoneme, but it does change major characteristics. Coke instead of coat, so the final T becomes a K due to the influence of the initial K. Bed becomes beb. The final D becomes a B due to the influence of the initial B. Then we also have regressive assimilation. So that's going to be changes in the phoneme characteristics due to influence of a sound occurring later in the word. So the sound segment influences a preceding sound. For instance, income, we might say the in becomes an ing due to the influence and preparation of that K, the velar K sound. Income versus income. Is she might change to is she. So the Z phoneme becomes the Z sound, like in measure. Additionally, take might become cake. So the initial T becomes a K. Candy might be nandy, or nanny, So the K in candy might become an N. That's nasal assimilation. In addition to co-articulation and assimilation, I also want to talk about some phonological processes. Now, these are things that are really going to make changes in our speech. Some of these we do because it makes things a little bit quicker. But typically, phonological processes are going to be when a child is learning how to speak, they don't have all the sounds in their repertoire right at the beginning. Their consonant inventory can be quite limited just based on their age. That is developmentally appropriate. So what happens is children are super smart, and our brains are so fascinating that when children don't have a specific phoneme, they all use these same rules, rule-based errors. And so even though they're making an error, there's a rule behind why they're using that particular sound to change what the target word should be. So one of these phonological processes is called addition. It's when we're adding a sound. Generally, it helps break up a consonant cluster or to provide a transition between sounds. Typically, we'll use the unstressed to add into a word. So you might hear a child say baloo instead of blue, or tree instead of tree, or stay in instead of stay in. So we've added the y there. Another phonological process is omission. Sometimes this is also called deletion. It is when we're actually leaving out a part of the word or a phoneme in the word. So national might become national. Stop them might become stop 'em. So this can happen, one, as a phonological process when a child doesn't have all of those sounds like the TH and stop them. It may also be in order to more quickly get your phrase out. So if you're talking really rapidly in a conversation, you might just take out the TH in them and say stop them instead of stop them. It's just quicker to get that phrase out. Haplology is going to be the omission or deletion of a whole syllable. So when we say Mississippi, we might talk really fast and say Mississippi. Mississippi instead of Mississippi. Additional phonological processes, we have backing. That's going to be taking a front sound and moving it to the back. So instead of tap, I might use cap. So the T is moved back to the K. I might, instead of dog, I might use gog. And one I really like, I use this quite a bit with my students as an example. When I had a little boy in therapy a couple years back, I asked the dad what sounds he would like me to work on, because it's always good to get that parent involvement. So he used backing, and he said, I really want you to work on D. And I said, okay, is there any particular reason? And he said, yes, because when we're going through the store and my son's trying to get my attention, he always says, gag, gag, instead of dad, dad. Again, we're backing. We're moving those front sounds, the D, back to a G. So kind of funny story for you there, but backing can be, it was really concerning for the dad that the child kept saying gag, you know, when he was trying to get his attention. So let's keep going through some of these. We have fronting. That's going to be the opposite. So that's taking a back sound and moving it to the front of the mouth when you produce it. So instead of dog, it might be dawed. Kite might change to tight. We also have final consonant deletion. That's very similar to what it sounds. So it's deleting the final consonant in a word or the last consonant in the word. So pig might change to pi. Mouse might be mow. So we're just not using that final S or final G in pig. Stopping is the changing the manner of a non-plosive sound to a plosive. So that's substituting a stop consonant for a fricative or an affricate. So instead of soup, we might use toop. So we're using the S, that fricative, is turning to a stop, the T. Knife might change to nipe instead. Gliding, usually when we're changing from liquids to glides. So for instance, remember a liquid is an R or an L, so we're changing those sounds to a glide, which is a W or a Y sound, a W or a Y. When we're doing that, this happens quite frequently. You might hear play instead of play, one instead of run, wake instead of lake. So they don't, typically it would be L and R a little bit later developing sounds. So when a child does not have those sounds in their consonant inventory, they will use a different sound to substitute it. That being said, most children use the same rule. So remember, these are rule-based errors. Phonological processes are rule-based errors. So if a child doesn't have the L, then they might use wake for lake. Okay? The last one here is deaffrication. So that's simplifying the affricates. It's deleting the stop from an affricate. So for instance, instead of cheese, it might be sees, or jar might be czar. Okay, now that we've got a little bit of information about phonological processes, I know that was pretty short, but just to give you a little bit of background there, I want to talk about broad and narrow transcription. So prior in transcription project 1 and prior to now, we've been focusing on broad transcription. We use the phonemic symbols only, so we're using slash marks with those phonemic symbols. But when we're talking about suprasegmentals and diacritics, when we want to add more detail to the description of speech besides just the phonemic symbols, maybe we want to demonstrate some of those variations in the allophones, then we need to use diacritics. And that's when we're going to start using brackets. And this is going to be more narrow transcription. So I want to talk about some diacritics because this is what's going to make our more narrow transcription. A diacritic marking is going to be a special modification. It's a marker used to indicate an allophone, a variation in that phoneme. So diacritics can be grouped into several different categories. We have tongue shape or position, sound source, including voicing, nasality, timing, length, stop release, lip shape. We can talk about syllables. We can talk about stress and other syllables. So let's go through all of these so you get an idea. For tongue shape, I'm going to go through some of these diacritics. There are a ton more in your book, but I'm just going to focus on the most common ones, or the ones you'll hear or see most frequently. So the first one, is tongue shape or position. So let's talk about dentalized. You'll see here is the diacritic that you'll use. You're going to place that diacritic below the affected phoneme. So the phoneme that's dentalized, that is where you're going to put that diacritic. Basically, you are articulating with the tip of your tongue against the back of your upper teeth, where your alveolar ridge is. For example, when I'm using the D in width, we move our tongue a lot more forward compared to when I use D in the word lid. Lid, width. Okay? When we're using lateralized consonants, that's when the air is released through the sides of the mouth or the cheek. It kind of sounds slurpy or lisp. So if I said, this is going to be placed below the affected phoneme as well, you'll see it's kind of like a half moon or half circle shape. Right now it's kind of in between the S and the L, but it should go right underneath that S if S is the one affected. So it might sound like schlip instead of slip. Schlip. Sometimes it can sound so slurpy, it kind of sounds like a sh sound, but it's not. So that's going to be a variation of the S. You know we've not substituted, it's not another phoneme, it's still S, but there's a variation on the S that we need to account for. For sound source, including voicing, we have partially voiced. So that's going to be voicing a consonant that typically is not voiced. So if we're using the S, like in the word absent and absurd, we typically do this. So we've added a little bit of voicing to that S. It's not a Z, but it's not a devoiced S either. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. So then we would show that diacritic that's going to be placed below the S, or the affected phoneme. We have partially devoiced as well. That's a little circle indicated below the affected phoneme, and that's when a typically voiced segment is now partially devoiced or completely voiceless. So in the word cheese or dog, they're partially devoiced. The G in dog isn't quite a K, so that would be its voiceless cognate. It's not a K, but it's not quite a true G, that G sound, okay? Children do have a tendency to devoice final obstruents, so in the word like dog or shoes. In addition, we actually devoice liquids and glides when they follow voiceless sounds, like in the word play and tree. We also have nasal symbols for diacritics. We have nasalized, looks like the little tilde It's produced when we're using nasal resonance. You'll see this in patients with unrepaired cleft palates and sometimes even repaired cleft palate. But basically, they're adding airflow through the nasal cavity when we shouldn't have it. Now, there are some times when we just do this in our typical speech, and that's because the consonants around that vowel are affecting the vowel. So, for instance, in the word man and tan, the N at the end is affecting that vowel in order to make it more nasalized when really it shouldn't be. Now, that's completely typical, but it's just showing how the sounds in a word can affect the other phonemes. So if I'm using bad, that ah sounds a lot different than when I say man. Man, bad. Okay, those vowels are different. They're slightly different. We also have nasal emission. I had to draw these in because for some reason I couldn't find them on Word in the IPA extensions or with that IPA type it. So for nasal emission, it's an audible nasal emission on a sound. This is going to be marked, placed above the vowel or consonant that's affected. So if I'm using a nasal emission, it sounds kind of like a puff of air. So it might be small, sun. So you kind of hear a puff of air out of the nose. It's often seen in patients with cleft palate and VPI, velopharyngeal insufficiency. And the way you can test for this is by using your finger. So sun, sun. It's kind of almost a snort at times. Sun. You can hear that snort come out, and I can feel it against my finger. You could also use a mirror, a dental mirror, and place it underneath the patient's nose. And if it fogged up, that would show you that there's some nasal emission. That's also a good test if you're testing for nasalized sounds. You put that mirror under here. If it fogs up when it's not supposed to, then that would show you had nasalized consonants. You do have to be careful though, because if you were to try it with the word man, the M and the N are both nasalized, so that's not going to help you with that middle vowel sound. So it would have to be in a whole word of non-nasal sounds, and you're trying to see if they're using some nasalized speech. We also have denasalized. That's when the nasal segment is going to be produced without nasalization when it should be. So again, the mark is placed above the vowel that's affected. So for instance, in the word rain, it sounds like almost nasal congestion. So if, you know, some people will say, I have such nasal speech, I have a cold. That's actually the opposite. You have denasalized your speech, or hyponasal speech, rather than actual nasalized or hypernasal. So it would sound, if I talk like this, so if I'm plugging my nose, it kind of sounds like you have a cold. That's the denasalized. Okay, we also have timing and length diacritics. One of them is lengthened. So this is when a sound is prolonged. It shows that there is a greater duration in articulation than what's expected. So if I said, for instance, fit, so I'm extending that vowel, or see, I'm extending that vowel. We do actually use this in therapy, especially for children or adults with fluency disorders. One of the treatment strategies is to prolong or stretch their speech. And when you prolong, you help slow down their speech and get their articulators ready for the next word, which helps decrease disfluencies. So I might say, if I was reading this first line, I might say, sound is prolonged. So I'm prolonging those sounds much more than expected. I can show that with the lengthened diacritic. We have stop release. So aspirated is using that little H. That's going to be placed above and to the right of the affected phoneme. It's when we're using a voiceless stop produced with a puff of air at the beginning of the word. So if I said tap, but I said tap, so I'm adding that puff of air, tap versus tap, tap, tap. It's a very slight difference there. There's also unreleased. So this is when you expect there to be a release, an audible burst of air, but you're not hearing that. So if I'm using lap, I expect to hear a p at lap. But instead, if I did lap, lap, see the difference? So there's a burst of air or there's not. Lap, lap. So that's unreleased, when we're not releasing that air. And that one is also placed to the right of the, above and to the right of the affected phoneme. We have lip-shaped diacritics, including labelization. That's when we're rounding a sound with our lips more so than we expect or when we don't expect them to be rounded. It's kind of like if we round vowels, but you're doing it with a consonant. So typically this will happen when a consonant is followed by either a rounded vowel or by the phoneme W. And we're going to place this diacritic above the affected phoneme. So right now it's showing to the right of the phoneme, above and to the right, but it's actually above. It should be above the K, I apologize. So if I am using queen, you'll notice queen, my K is rounded because it's anticipating the rounding of the W. Also, in the word stew, we have the S and the T are both rounded and anticipating the oo. Stew, stew. See, we have that rounding with both of those consonants. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to stop right here and then I will continue in just a minute.